In 1996, Bill Gates said, "Content is king." And boy, was he right. 3 decades later, it still occupies the throne. For lawyers, law firms, and companies serving the legal industry, content marketing and thought leadership marketing are a must if they want to build their books of business or increase their revenues. Hi, I'm Wayne Pollock. I'm a former Law 50 senior associate who discovered the world of content marketing and thought leadership marketing and hasn't looked back. In each episode of this podcast, I interview lawyers and legal industry in-house marketers who are doing big things with their content marketing and thought leadership marketing. This is Legally Contented. Welcome to episode number 25 of Legally Contented. I'm your host, Wayne Pollock. One of the great things about content marketing and thought leadership marketing is that you can take that content, you can take those blog posts, you can take those articles, take those podcasts, repurpose them, recycle them, and package them up to be used in new and interesting ways that still further your marketing and business development efforts, just not in the original form that the content once took. My guest on this episode, David Johnson, does an amazing job of that. He is a managing shareholder in the Fort Worth, Texas office of Winstead, which is an Law 150 firm. He is a fiduciary litigator, and his blog that he maintains is called, wait for it, The Fiduciary Litigator. Now, of course, on his blog, he covers Texas fiduciary litigation cases, but much more interestingly, he repackages that content often into presentations and then gives presentations to clients, to prospective clients, to bar associations and similar meetings where he can stand as a thought leader because he is presenting 20, 30, 40, 50, 80 blog posts regarding Texas fiduciary litigation law over the past quarter, over the past year, and now referral sources, prospective clients can have no doubt in their mind who is the go-to Texas fiduciary litigation attorney in the state. What David is doing with his blog and the repurposing of his blog posts is a textbook example of how lawyers can use thought leadership marketing and business development content to fuel the majority of their marketing and business development efforts. I hope you enjoy my conversation with David. David Johnson, welcome to Legally Contented. Please introduce yourself for our audience.
Hello, I'm David Johnson. I'm a fiduciary litigator based in Fort Worth, Texas with the Winstead Law Firm.
David, I appreciate you taking time out of your busy day to chat with me. One of the reasons why I wanted to talk to you, or really the main reason, was the Fiduciary Litigator blog. I think that's a fascinating niche, fiduciary litigation, and I'm very curious to hear about how that blog came to be and the process that you go through to have a blog that presumably has benefited your career and your ability to bring in business to the firm. But before we go there, can you give me a little bit of background about your practice, where you went to law school? I know you've been at Winstead now for 21 years, which to me is fascinating, but give me a little bit of sense of your practice and how you came to be where you are today.
So I went to Baylor undergrad in law school and graduated in 1997 from law school, clerked for a judge for a year, then came out and worked in a small firm for 3 years in Waco, and got a lot of trial experience. Did insurance defense, car wreck cases, other commercial litigation, did some fiduciary litigation, a little bit of everything in the kind of a civil trial lawyer side of it. And then I came up to Fort Worth and joined Winstead in 2001. And so at that time, I was a baby lawyer still, a litigation associate, but I'd had a lot of trial experience compared to other people in the firm. And so I started working with a lot of the lawyers from all the offices when they needed, someone who, kind of knew what a trial was and how to prepare for it and strategies behind it. And so that kind of grew into a litigation, a general commercial litigation practice. Winstead, main two practice areas are banking and then real estate. And so if you're at Winstead, you're going to do a lot of banking work. You're going to do a lot of real estate work. Interestingly, and I don't know that you didn't, you did ask for my backstory. So then I start getting into, I look at it and go, well, it's going to be hard to practice just as a general trial lawyer. That was the old model. You were just a really good trial lawyer and people thought you were a dog in the courtroom. So you got big cases. But I, at an early part in my career, I saw that as difficult in a big market like Fort Worth and Dallas. And so I tried to have a niche area. And my first foray into that was appellate work. I've always really enjoyed, I worked at a court of appeals. I really enjoyed the research and writing. Published a lot of law review articles. So I thought this is kind of where I want to set my hook. And so I did that for probably 6-7 years and got up to probably 90-95% of my practice was appellate work. And then I started having, and that got me to income shareholder. It got me, I was really involved in statewide bar, local bar. I was a fairly well-known appellate lawyer for Texas standards, but I still had a hard time doing business development. Like I couldn't bring in a lot of clients. And a part of that is just that there's not that much appellate work and there's a lot of competition for it. There's a lot of former Texas Supreme Court judges and Court of Appeals judges out there, and everybody wants to hire a judge to do an appellate brief. Although in Texas, you run for office for a judge. Being an appellate judge doesn't mean you're ever a good legal writer or researcher or arguer. But the consumer doesn't know that. And so I started thinking like, how am I going to take control of my career? How am I going? And the only way to do that is to have a client base. And so that led me to think, what do I want to do? What do I really enjoy in a trial perspective? And I had had enough experience in the fiduciary area representing trust and estate, bank trust departments, those sorts of things. And I said, that's where I kind of want to go. And so that's kind of how I got into fiduciary litigation. Was I had a lot of different experience, but I didn't have a lot of success in business development. And so I thought I needed to get into a niche area that I enjoyed. And that's how I got into the fiduciary area.
Did you have the benefit of a partner or a senior associate pull you aside in those early days and say, hey, David, look, we know you love appellate work, but listen, the only way to have autonomy as a lawyer and to arguably only really control your future is to find a practice that will give you a book of business. Appellate work, sorry, buddy, it's just not it. Did you have that benefit, or was this more of a realization you came to on your own?
It was a realization that I came to on my own. The firm was fine with me doing appellate work, but no one came up to me and tried to dissuade me from that. But it was frustrating to me not reaching my own goals for business development. And the firm was, there's always someone saying, hey, I got this friend over here who does appellate work. Let's talk about bringing them into the law firm. And I was like, well, we don't really have enough work for all these different appellate lawyers. So there was just kind of these threats to my business existence, as it were, that I didn't like to. So I came across that thought of my own of, I need to get out of this and start doing something else.
I remember being envious when I was at Deckert for those 6.5 years as a complex commercial litigation attorney. I'd always joke that my only niche are the federal rules of civil procedure based on the kind of work that we did. And I was very envious of my friends who may have been making 70% of what I was making, but they had a niche. They had a niche quickly. They were in court. They were dealing with a client as a third year. It's interesting when you have a niche that you can market to, how much the world opens up because you don't have the same kinds of frustrations trying to build a book of business or to even know which way to point your marketing and BD efforts like you might have for appellate work or general litigation. That the niche really helps you find an area of law that you can dig into and presumably find a more dedicated group of would-be clients and referral sources to get to know, to develop relationships with through content, through shaking hands and going out to dinner or breakfast, as it may be. I'm curious about what made you choose Winstead. I realize we're going back now 2 decades, but you've been there for 21 plus years. Presumably, what got you there has kept you there. But I'm just fascinated by the idea, as someone who graduated law school in 2009, the fact that you've been somewhere for 21 years, what does that say about the firm? And I'm curious what it has to say about the state of the industry from your perspective about firms not being able to retain partners or associates for very long these days.
So I would say what brought me to Winstead was more geographic. There was an opening in the Fort Worth office, and it was a larger firm, a regional firm. And so I thought it would be a good opportunity. I was in Waco with my wife. I grew up in Waco. My wife did not, and she was bluntly tired of being in Waco. So I thought we needed to leave for our marital harmony. And so I thought Fort Worth would be a good place to go. Now, that's completely different as to why I've stayed 21 years. The reason I've stayed at Winstead for 21 years is because it's been a really good platform for my practice. And I like the way it's run. It's a well-run business law firm. We have a non-lawyer who's the kind of a COO of our firm. So it's a well-run firm. It's a very democratic firm. I guess I'm a little more independent, so I like to be included in decision making. And so they include us in decision making by we actually get to vote on who runs our law firm, both as the lawyer head of the firm and for the board of directors. People can run for office, and we vote just like you would in a democracy. And it's not a preordained type thing, that someone runs, but no one's running against them, and the powers that be. All shareholders at Winstead see all of the information. So I see how much everybody makes. I see how much they've brought in. I see how much they brought in from their working hours, how much they brought in from their billing hours. So it's a complete open book, which creates some frustrations because it's easy to then compare and contrast and say, why did that person make X and this and I only made Y? But we have a subjective compensation system. It is not formula based. And so you have to have faith that the board of directors are doing the right thing. They know information than we do. Every year in January, we do a self-evaluation and give the board as much information as we can outside of the numbers, which obviously they see the numbers. And that's how they subjectively put us into buckets and compensate us that way. I've always felt like I've been treated fairly. And once again, getting back to the basics of Winstead, banking, real estate, and a fiduciary area where I represent a lot of bank trust departments. I'm on almost all of the bank's approved lists, which is a big deal. And so I have to fight to get work from the client, but if the client wants to send me work, they can. If I was in some other law firm and I'm not on the approved list, even if they love me, they may not be able to send me any work. And so it's been a good platform that way as well. So I know I'm a bit of a cheerleader for Winstead, but it's been a good place for me in my career. And, have I thought about leaving? Of course, everybody thinks about the grass is always greener. But I think the way that Winstead is run and our culture, I'm not unusual. There are a number of lawyers at Winstead that have been here for 20, 30, 40 years. Of course, we have a bit of a revolving door like every firm. But there's a base of people at Winstead that have been here a long time. And I think that is what keeps our culture going.
How does the firm do in terms of its marketing and business development efforts? What's the culture like at that firm? Obviously, you took the horse by its reins and decided that you were going to enter a practice where you could develop business. But how much of that exists as a culture at the firm versus how much of it is left to the attorney's own devices?
So it's always strange to me when I hear people say they're at X firm and they're almost discouraged from finding new clients. They just want them there to work on such and such. Winstead's a very entrepreneurial law firm, and it supports all of its lawyers trying to build their own practice and build the business base of the law firm. And so, I can honestly say I don't think I've ever been rejected for any kind of business development expense that I've asked for that was at least halfway reasonable. And so the firm's been very supportive from a financial way of supporting my practice and other people's practices in the firm. So we want lawyers to build their own practice. We want them to grow while they're here and not just be a service partner. Obviously, there are a lot of lawyers that don't want to do that and want to be service partners, and we have a place for them as well.
Before we dig into your own business development and marketing efforts, I'm curious, can you touch on your view of why partners and associates don't seem to stick around at their law firms very often, especially on the partner side? There's like a free agent world where if you have a book of business and it's portable, you are going to perhaps look for the highest bidder. And then we all know with associates, it seems to be a life cycle of 3 to 4 years for most of them before they move firms. I'm just curious, in your 2+ decades at Winstead and as an observer of both the Texas legal market and the national market, what do you see has changed? And do you think there's ever a chance that the industry goes back to the way it was 20, 30 years ago in terms of not having a ton of mobility for its partners and associates?
So I've only been at Winstead, so it's hard for me to say what it's like in another law firm. I do have and have recruited lawyers to come to Winstead and to come to our Fort Worth office, come to our other offices. And so I hear them and the complaints they have. And I think other firms are, maybe don't have a personal touch. And a lawyer feels like I'm there as a cog, and they're not as loyal to the law firm. And so if they're not loyal to the law firm, they don't, get to see all the numbers. They're not in the in crowd. They're not part of the control group that doesn't ever change except every, 30 years when someone dies and then their heir apparent becomes the next leader or controller of the firm. I don't think there's an impetus to stay there if I can make an extra buck somewhere else. I don't have any loyalty. And so that, to me, I probably could make more money in another firm. I don't really entertain headhunters calls or whatnot, because I'm typically pretty happy where I am. But I think that's probably why you see that more now. I think 30 years ago, 40 years ago, I think there probably was a little more loyalty to law firms. And that may not just be law firms. I think that's probably corporate America too. And so I think, loyalty has kind of ebbed down. Personal interactions have ebbed down. You see younger generations, they don't like to get around each other as much as we did. We used to like happy hours. We liked going to lunch together. We liked interacting. Now lawyers want to work from home, and God forbid they get together for a beverage or a lunch or whatever. And so I think a lot of that is generational. And I know maybe I sound like an old man, but but I think that has a lot to do with it as well.
Let's shift down to your business development and marketing efforts. You touched a bit earlier on in our conversation about how the marketing and business development aspect of your career is what led to your shift in practice. Taking me up until you launched the Fiduciary Litigator blog, what were you doing as a fiduciary litigator in your practice to build your book of business, and then walk me through the thought process that led to you establishing the Fiduciary Litigator blog?
So I would say I tried to be a little more of an old school business generator, be on civic organizations, go to a lot of meetings, try to meet people in the community, try to, meet people that could maybe give me work, and ask them to lunch and that sort of thing, without a lot of the content marketing. And I would send out emails with alerts, but it was fairly sporadic, and and I actually had an earlier blog that I tried to focus in doing financial industry kind of appellate, and so it was called the Financial Appellate Voice was the blog, and it was basically just all things banking in Texas, and it was way too diffuse. It was too broad, and so I had a hard time posting on it because there was just so much material to post on. How could I ever keep up if it was my full-time job, if I was going to do that? And so I kind of learned from that failure. And I find in my life, I learn a lot more from failures than I do successes. And so when I started focusing on the fiduciary stuff, which I'd always kind of done just because other lawyers that I'd worked with were estate planners, and they would have a will contest, or they had a relationship with the bank and they've got a trust dispute. And so as their, young associate, older associate, young partner, I would work on those files for them. So I'd had some experience in that area. And so it was a matter of how do I market myself as an expert in that area, in that niche area. And so that's when I came up with doing this Fiduciary Litigator blog, and just kind of scrapped the blog and said, no, we're just going to report on fiduciary cases and other fiduciary articles. And that's what really took off, because it was a much more narrow subset of information to report on, and it became a lot more successful for me.
Could you have gone down an even further niche? Is there a niche within the fiduciary litigation world that might have been applicable to a particular group of would-be clients or referral sources that you perhaps wanted more of?
Yes. And so originally I really focused on trust and estate. And anytime you work with any substantial trust, there's probably going to be closely held business issues, closely held business interests that the trust owns. And so I had, of course, worked on partnership disputes and closely held business disputes as a general commercial litigator, and started handling more and more of that because of my trust and estate work. And so Winstead has another blog, the Winstead Business Divorce blog. And so I actually changed my fiduciary blog probably about 3 years ago to include business divorce cases, both within my blog, and then I also post the same material on Winstead's business divorce blog. And so I'm marketing kind of to people who have trust disputes, estate disputes, and then closely held business disputes, because the fiduciary issues can be similar, and the area of law is very similar, and so it's a good cross mix, and that's kind of what my practice is now.
Given where you were at in the firm, given the firm's views on marketing and business development efforts, did you need to get buy-in from the firm for either the first blog or this current Fiduciary Litigator blog before you actually launched?
I got buy-in from the firm easily. They've always been very supportive, and part of it is that the person that was probably most associated with our firm, was the president of our firm for many, many years, was a man named Mike Baggett. And Mike had a treatise that was the Texas Foreclosure Manual. And he had that for 30 years and was known and it was thought leadership. It wasn't on the internet. It wasn't blogs. It was the old school binder on someone's desk. But people would hire Mike because he was the foreclosure expert in Texas. And so I think the firm has always been responsive to thought leadership. And so it was very, it's a new medium, but the firm was very quick to support the blog financially.
What about blogging was interesting to you? This is the second blog. Obviously, it's been around for, by my count, almost 7 years. What about blogging drew you to that particular form of marketing and business development, specifically that form of content marketing versus other avenues available to you at that time?
So, like I said, for a long time, I did appellate work. And as a business developer for my appellate practice, I wrote extensive papers and did a lot of speaking at bar events, trying to talk to trial lawyers about how smart I am and see this wonderful paper. And so I've always, like I said, really enjoyed the research and writing. I don't think you can do a blog if you don't like to write. You can do it without research, I guess, and just blog on personal experiences and that sort of thing and advice. But I've always really enjoyed the research and the writing aspect of it. To me, it's an enjoyable hobby, and so that's what drove me thinking a blog would be successful, and just because I enjoy doing it.
Yeah, it's funny. Even though people often talk about podcasts or videos being a key way for your prospective clients and referral sources to get to know you, they can still get to know you through writing. And if anything, writing shows them that you can string together in hopefully compelling ways thoughts and ideas. And one day, perhaps you'll be stringing together their thoughts and ideas in the form of advocacy on their behalf for a legal issue. People like to hop on trends like video and podcasts, but the good old-fashioned written word, if you're a good writer, you can show people what you're thinking, explain how you think, and that rubs off on people. They can see very quickly which lawyers, which professional services providers are interesting, are compelling, provide interesting content versus those who just vomit up on the screen 1,000 words regarding a recent case and expect the reader to take from that whatever they want. What was your plan for the frequency of the blog? There are some big law firm blogs that are posting multiple times a week. I met with someone whose consumer financial practice group wants to post 5 times a day based on what happens in the industry. How did you decide what your frequency would be with your posts?
So I try to post on a weekly basis, and I guess I'm a little controlling, and so I don't have anyone else post on my blog. I'm the only one that posts on the Winstead business divorce blog. We have multiple people posting on it, but on my fiduciary blog, that is just me. And so, typically what I'll do is I'll sit down on a Saturday afternoon or a Sunday afternoon and write 3, 4, or 5 blog posts, and then that'll be good for 2 or 3, 4 weeks. And so I try to post weekly. I know I've had other people say, I had a former partner that had a blog, and he'd try to post every 6 weeks to 2 months on a little more of it was a different kind of format than the way I do it. And like you say, some people post more often. I just I don't know if there's any magic to it. That's just probably the reason I do it that way, is because that's just my own internal clock. Let's try to get something up once a week and keep people kind of looking at it.
What process do you use to stay informed on the cases and other issues that you're going to write about? Do you have email alerts? Do you work with a colleague? What's the process for getting that funnel of information into David's hands, where then he can then decide which posts or which developments will be posted about?
So it's as simple as in LexisNexis, you can sign up for email alerts, and we have a certain search terms. And so if a case hits those search terms, I get an email. So I get daily emails from Lexis saying, here are the new case law in Texas with these search terms. And, out of every 10 hits, you may only have 1 or 2 that you want to blog on. But so there's the time of kind of looking through them and seeing, is this the case I want to blog on? And then, yes, it is, or no, it's not. I email it to myself, and then it's when I have time, I will then blog on it. And I try not to make it just a dry recitation of a case. I try to, give enough of the facts to make it as interesting as possible. And I try to have an interesting note at the end for cases that are interesting, where I give maybe my spin on the case, or why I think it was right, why I think it was wrong, or what arguments the parties didn't think of, or the court didn't think of, or, just something to kind of give a little added benefit to the reader.
One thing I've noticed with your posts are, to your point, they're not terribly long. We're not talking 2,000 words. How do you balance brevity with still being informative? Because you can understand how you could mismatch that balance, and then the reader walks away thinking, well, what the hell did I just read? There's nothing of value here. How do you balance that?
Good question. I figure, people's attention spans are, they don't want to sit and read a long thesis on something. So I try to just hit the high point from the case note and from my interesting note. I still do a lot of speaking. Now before it was kind of procedure oriented, like trial, here's how you preserve error in voir dire, or here's how you preserve error in summary judgments or appeal summary judgments. Now it's very industry focused. Now it's very fiduciary focused. I talk about trust distributions, or I talk about closely held business rights, owners' rights. And so I do a lot of papers, and I have a lot of, very detailed, lengthy papers that I probably could chop up for blog posts, and probably should. But I just post those papers up to my blog so people can see that I've done a speech and here's the materials. And so like last year, I did a 125-page paper on trust distributions in Texas, and that paper's up there in the blog, and people can see it and look through it. So I do have lengthy, dense material that you can access on the blog, but the quote blog posts are typically, like you say, a little more shorter and to the point.
How are you using those longer form pieces of content, 125-page pieces of content, for your marketing BD efforts? Were those commissioned by certain organizations, or what are you doing with those longer form pieces?
So a couple of things. First of all, I started my blog, and then I started, trying to do. My blog is hooked up to Twitter. It's hooked up to LinkedIn. It's hooked up to JD Supra. So when I post, all these things go out to those things. And then I started trying to do. I probably the last 5 years, I've done 4 or 5 years quarterly webinars. So I'll do a 1 hour webinar every quarter on an industry specific fiduciary issue, usually mostly trust and estates. And so I oftentimes will do a paper associated with those webinars. And then I try to repurpose it, and then I give it to give it to industry groups. There's Texas Bankers Association. I've given it to national groups, multiple different webinar CLE providers, and so I try to repurpose the material when I have a longer paper like that. So I'm touching on multiple things. The webinars go straight to my clients. I've got about 1,500 bank representatives and other lawyers that have signed up for my webinars. And so they get the alert, I'm having a webinar, here's the topic, they can sign up for it. And then I try to use that same material and go to, bar groups, go to, probate bar groups, business dispute, Texas Bar Business Disputes course, that sort of thing, fiduciary litigation course. And so, the more you can repurpose it, the better.
I love the fact that you've created the cycle of you've got these webinars, you've got the speeches you give, then you have the blog, which is like this living, breathing business card where you can play with the speaking engagement. They meet you, they like what you have to say. Follow me on my blog, follow me on LinkedIn, where you'll see more content around fiduciary litigation. And likewise, you can use the blog to show off some of the longer form analysis that you might be doing, or to highlight where you are going to be speaking. It just has a nice kind of virtuous cycle where once people get drawn into the David Johnson fiduciary litigation vacuum, they're there to stay because you're giving them so many other points of information and ways to get that information.
Right. And so one of the things I do is I take all of my blog material and put it into a paper once a year. And so I have a fiduciary litigation update. And, it's typically, with the blog post, it's typically 80 to 100 pages of material. And I do a PowerPoint, and I select just the most interesting or important cases. And I do a PowerPoint and do an hour-long presentation. I then trot that out to bar groups and specifically to my bigger clients. And so I'll go in and give a lunch and learn, provide them free lunches, give them my fiduciary litigation update. And then that's my fourth webinar every year in December is my fiduciary litigation update. So if somebody wasn't able to see it live, they can see it that way. And so it's a great way to repurpose material that's already on my blog. I've already done the work. I'm just putting it together in a format that is easy to digest and understand. And then at the end of it, you feel like, okay, I've heard the 10 or 15 most important fiduciary cases that came out the last year. I feel like I'm a little more up to date on the status of the law.
It's brilliant because you've already done the work, right? You've done 95% of the work, and yeah, you might have to format it a bit and you have to go back and reread some things to create your reports or your PowerPoints. But the idea that you're building this knowledge, I would equate it to working out at the gym every day and then going to run the marathon once a year, where every day you are building this muscle, where you're reviewing these cases, you're publishing once a week, whatever it might be, on the blog post. And then because of all of that work you've done throughout the year or throughout the quarter, you can go to a client with this nice substantive thought leadership piece and remind them, hey, look, I'm your guy. Maybe I have your business already. Maybe I can have more of your business, whatever it might be. I am the authority regarding this area of the law because look at what I do on a daily basis or on a weekly basis. I've given you these reports, and think about the ancillary thought leadership that comes out of it. For example, you could have a trends report where you look back and what happened in 2022 case law for fiduciary litigation and what are some of the trends that emerge. And you can have a forecast for 2023. There are all these ways that you can tinker with and repurpose the content. You've done it already. You've done most of the hard work, and it just shows you the value of a system. You alluded to earlier that you have the Lexis email alerts. Heaven help the lawyers who are writing content regarding an area of the law for which they can't have a Westlaw or Lexis or Bloomberg email alert, because it is a pain in the butt to plug in search terms or have a paralegal or an associate do that grunt work for you when it could be automated in the fashion that you've done it. So I think you're really showing how systems and processes can help with the creation of a thought leadership program, of a content marketing program like a blog, but also all the benefits that you can gain from repurposing that actual blog content for client-facing or prospective client-facing or referral source-facing materials and meetings. I think it's amazing. Do you need help at the firm in terms of packaging all this stuff? Do you have resources, or is this stuff that you tend to do yourself?
We have a marketing group, and we have marketing professionals that help me with all of my webinars. I just show up and give it, and speak into the mic. And same thing for lunch and learns. I just I reach out to my clients and set a time and a date, and then they run with making sure that they've got the materials, they've got the PowerPoint, they get the lunches to them, etc. So I mean, obviously, I have a lot of support, and I'm. One of the things I've always prided myself on as a equity shareholder in this law firm, I have never had an associate write a paper for me. I've never had an associate write a blog post for me. It's all my own work, and I've never asked any lawyer in this law firm to do free work for me for marketing. And so that's just my own personal morals. I just don't think it's fair to have someone do that. But once again, I enjoy it. You have to be disciplined. Hopefully you enjoy that process. If you don't enjoy it, I don't think you can do it. I mean, I just don't see how you could do what I do if you didn't enjoy that. And, like I said, you have to be disciplined and say, you know what, I haven't posted in a while. I'm running low. And so I need to, sit down for a couple of hours and knock this out. And once I get into it, I always enjoy it. So, and like a lot of trial lawyers, I have a big ego. So I like telling people what I think. And I like telling the Texas Supreme Court when I think they get something terribly wrong.
So when did you start to see the blog bear fruit, and what kind of fruit did it bear? Were you seeing clients reach out to you, whether they're current or prospective? Were you seeing referral sources, again, either current or prospective? What did you see in terms of the effect of the blog on your marketing and business development efforts?
So having the blog is interesting. My business base has grown a lot, but it's also done side benefits that I didn't really expect. The blog and the webinars have led to, completely new corporate clients that some of them I never heard of, and some of them, I'd heard of and didn't really have many relationships. So I see them, looking at my blog, I see them attending my webinars. I reach out to them and say, hey, you want to go to lunch? And you try to have some sort of personal relationship with them. And then eventually, they'll kind of start sending you work because they view you as the expert. And then, interestingly, I've gotten a lot of individual clients who look at this material, and so I'll get hired by individuals all over the state of Texas. I have a statewide practice now, whereas before I was kind of really more based in Fort Worth and Dallas. And now I've got cases all over the state because people find my blog, find my material, and say, this is a niche area. If I got a trust dispute in South Texas dealing with real estate, I need to hire this guy. And so before the blogs, before I transitioned, I probably did about $500,000 in billings, and it steadily grew, and I had a couple of years of around $1 million. Then I had a couple of years of around $2 million. And then this year I'm doing about $3.5 million in billings. And that's been over a 10-year period, 8-year period. And I think it's all, I can't say it's all attributable to just the blog, but the whole kind of, like you say, the kind of circular way of touch points that I'm doing have led to that. And then there's some interesting other things that have benefited me. I've had other lawyers look at my blog and refer work to me. And then I've had people hire me as an expert in the fiduciary area. And so I'm a testifying expert in cases, or consulting expert. I've had people say, look, recently I've had some lawyers say, look, we're not really fiduciary lawyers, but we don't want to commit malpractice. Can we just hire you and we'll pay you to just kind of look over our shoulder and make sure we're not making mistakes? And, depending on my time and whatnot, of course, I'm happy to do that. And then maybe lastly, I've had judges reach out to me and say, I've got this issue, you're not a lawyer on the case, and kind of confidentially, can I, we've got this issue. What are your thoughts on it? And so, of course, that's great for my ego when a judge calls me and asks me my opinion. Not that they take it, but they are curious as to what I would view a substantive issue is. And so, that's also been fun. And I don't think that probably would have happened, but for, this content marketing that I do.
Is the blog enough for you to be in pole position when a prospective client or a current client or a referral source comes to you? Or does it at least get you into the conversation? And then you still have to show them through in-person or Zoom or phone conversation that you deserve their business. How far does the blog on its own get you into the door versus you having to take it the last few steps over the finish line?
So I would say probably the blog and the materials gets me 90% of the way there. And I mean, obviously you have to have a personal connection with someone. You have to talk to them. You have to, what's your case about? Here are some issues we need to think about. And I've had a number of cases where people leave their current lawyer and want to retain me because maybe they're not doing something the way they want it done. You would say to be a little careful with that. Lawyers will tell you, if someone's leaving their first lawyer, sometimes they're bad clients to have. I've certainly had that experience too, but I've also had other cases where I get them in and they're a good client and they've got a good case, and the first lawyer just didn't know what they were doing. And so, I would say probably 90%, and then 10% is actually evaluating their case and their facts and trying to give some big picture thoughts on it that kind of sell yourself.
It's amazing all the work that you put in for the blog posts and the research you're doing and all the other materials you're producing can get you that far in. Just by showing up and being a regular contributor through your blog post, through the other vehicles, they can look at the many, many, many pages of your blog. I was researching when your blog first started. Your first post, at least as I found it, was October 1st, 2015. That was on page 51. So 51 pages of your blog of information. It just goes to show you how far that content can get you in the minds of prospective clients and referral sources, that it really does so much of the work that you might have to do yourself in terms of proving that you are the right person by showing them the blog, the content you create speaks for itself and gets you that far up into their mental rankings in terms of prospective counsel. I want to wrap up with two last questions. I appreciate all your time and I appreciate you being so forthcoming about the blog and your background and your views on marketing and business development. I'm curious your advice for both law firm in-house marketers and attorneys themselves regarding launching a blog. What tips, tricks, advice, pitfalls to watch for would you tell both in-house marketers at firms and attorneys if they want to launch a new blog?
First of all, I would say find people that enjoy writing and are disciplined. If I'm a marketing person trying to find a lawyer in my firm to do this. Secondly, I would say it seems counterintuitive. You'd think, well, the more I'm an expert in so many areas, the more odds are I'll get work in. And it's actually the opposite. The more narrow you get, the more niche practice you get, you actually get more work in. At least that's been my experience. And so don't make your blog too broad. Try to make it as narrow as is feasible. Realizing you need to have an audience, but make it narrow so that people know that if I have a trust dispute, this is the guy. So those would be kind of my two words of advice. Would be find someone who enjoys the writing and is disciplined and will keep up with it. Otherwise, you're just going to create a blog. You're going to post 5 times and it'll sit there. And B, make sure it's narrow enough that it hits a niche market and they view you as a niche expert.
That's a great place to end, David. I really, again, appreciate your time and your willingness to share with me today. Can you give our audience some places where they can find you, whether it's the website for Winstead, whether it's LinkedIn? Where would you prefer to be contacted through?
Well, probably what I look at the most are my emails. So I would say, dfjohnson@winstead.com. You can go to www.winstead.com and probably winsteadpc.com and look up people. You can go to my blog, fiduciarylitigator.com or winsteadbusinessdivorce.com. And that all will find links back to me, and you can email me, call me. And this is interesting. I've actually done business development presentations for accounting firms, for my own firm, kind of like everybody does it differently. This is the way I do it. And so I've really enjoyed being able to speak to you today. Obviously, I'm kind of passionate about it. I enjoy it, my hobby. And so this has been a lot of fun.
Well, great. David, again, thanks for your time, and I look forward to talking to you sometime soon.
Thank you.
Well, that's a wrap for this episode of Legally Contented. Thanks so much for tuning in. Check out the episode show notes for more information about our guests and for links to resources that we discussed during the episode. We'd appreciate your feedback and recommendations for future guests. Email us at hello@legallycontented.com, hello@legallycontented.com. We would appreciate if you told your colleagues about this podcast, if you subscribe to the podcast and urge them to subscribe as well. And while you're at it, maybe you could even rate and review the podcast on your favorite podcast player. Until next time, thanks so much for tuning in to Legally Contented.